A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine a country that does not issue a single birth certificate. Not one. There are no maternity wards, no natural population growth, and yet this place is a United Nations observer state with its own flag, its own anthem, and a legal system that dates back centuries. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the Vatican City state and the Holy See, and it really challenges every standard definition of what it means to be a country in 2026.
It is a total anomaly in international law, Corn. Most people think of it as just a big church with some nice museums, but it is a fully functioning sovereign entity. And by the way, fun fact for everyone listening, today's episode is actually powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It is helping us navigate the labyrinthine legal structures of the world's smallest state. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been obsessed with the Lateran Treaty lately because it is the only reason this setup even works.
I have always found the scale of it hilarious. 0.44 square kilometers. That is what, about 110 acres? To put that in perspective for our American listeners, it is roughly 11 times the size of the National Mall in D.C. You could walk across the entire country in about 20 minutes if you did not get stopped by a tourist group or a Swiss guard. But Daniel's question is the right one. How do you actually run a country that small without an economy or a tax base?
Well, the first thing we have to do is separate the two entities because they are not the same thing. You have the Holy See and you have the Vatican City state. The Holy See is the sovereign entity in international law. It is the one that sends ambassadors, who we call nuncios, and it is the one that signs treaties. The Vatican City state is just the physical territory, the dirt and the stone, that provides a base for that sovereignty. Think of the Holy See as the software and the Vatican City state as the hardware.
That is a rare Herman analogy, but I will allow it. So the software, the Holy See, has been around for almost 2,000 years in some form, but the hardware, the actual state, is relatively new, right?
I mean, not exactly. I should say it was established in 1929. Before that, the popes ruled the Papal States, which covered a huge chunk of central Italy. When Italy unified in the 19th century, they basically seized all that land, and the Pope became a prisoner in the Vatican for 60 years until Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty to settle the Roman question. That treaty is the bedrock of everything we are talking about today.
But wait, how did that 60-year prisoner situation work? If the Pope didn't recognize Italy, and Italy claimed the land, was there just a standoff at the gates for 6 decades?
Pretty much. It was a diplomatic nightmare. The popes refused to leave the walls because doing so would acknowledge the Italian state's authority over Rome. They essentially lived in a self-imposed exile within their own palace. There are stories of newly elected popes refusing to even step onto the external balcony of St. Peter's because it looked out over occupied territory. The Lateran Treaty was the ultimate let's agree to disagree document that finally carved out this tiny 110-acre bubble so the Pope could be a head of state again without having to be an Italian citizen.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty of Daniel's question about the people. If nobody is being born there, who are the citizens? Do they just hand out passports to anyone who can recite the liturgy in Latin?
Not quite. Vatican citizenship is one of the weirdest things in the world because it is not based on birthright, which we call jus soli, or bloodline, which is jus sanguinis. It is purely based on office or appointment. It is what you might call corporate citizenship. You are a citizen because you have a job to do for the Holy See, and the moment you stop doing that job, your citizenship evaporates.
That sounds like the ultimate at-will employment. Sorry, Corn, your sloth-like pace in the archives isn't cutting it anymore. Hand over your passport and get out of the country.
That is literally how it works. There are about 800 citizens total. Most of them are clergy, obviously, like cardinals living in Rome or diplomats stationed abroad. But you also have the Swiss Guard. They are all Vatican citizens during their term of service. But here is the catch. To be a Swiss Guard, you have to be a Swiss citizen first. You have to be Catholic, and you have to have finished basic training with the Swiss Armed Forces. When they finish their service and go back to Switzerland, they lose their Vatican citizenship and revert to being just Swiss.
But what happens if a Swiss guard falls in love? Can they bring a spouse into this citizen less void? How does the family unit work in a state that doesn't technically have families in the traditional sense?
It's actually possible. If a Swiss guard gets permission to marry, which usually requires them to be at least a corporal and 25 years old, their wife and children can be granted Vatican citizenship for the duration of the father's service. But again, it's temporary. The kids don't become Vaticanites for life. Once the father's contract is up, the whole family loses their citizenship. It's a very strange way to grow up, living in a palace where your nationality is tied to your dad's job performance.
What about the passports? Daniel asked specifically if they issued them. I am assuming they are not exactly high volume at the post office.
They do issue them, and they are highly functional. The governorate of Vatican City State issues them, usually valid for 10 years. They have the Pope's seal on the cover. The Pope himself actually holds passport number 1. But because the Vatican is not part of the Schengen area officially, though it has an open border with Italy, these passports are a bit of a collector's item in the world of international travel. Most Vatican citizens actually hold dual citizenship. They keep their original nationality, like Italian or German or American, and they use the Vatican passport for official business.
So if I am a layperson working in the Vatican museums, dusting off a statue of Apollo, am I a citizen? Or am I just a commuter?
You are almost certainly a commuter. There are about 3,000 people who work in the Vatican, but only a tiny fraction are citizens or even residents. Most of the staff are Italians who live in Rome and just walk through the gate every morning. There is a very strict distinction between being a citizen and being a legal resident. You might have a permit to live in an apartment inside the walls because you are a senior administrator, but that does not make you a citizen. It is a very exclusive club.
It is interesting to contrast that with somewhere like Monaco. In Monaco, citizenship is hard to get, but it is still traditional. You can be born into it, or you can marry into it. In the Vatican, you cannot marry into it because, well, the vast majority of the population is celibate. It is a state that essentially resets its entire population every generation.
It is the only state in the world that is truly sustainable only through recruitment. If the Catholic Church stopped functioning, the state would cease to exist almost instantly because there would be no one to hold the offices that grant citizenship. It is a functionalist state. And to Daniel's point about the little things, this functionalism extends to how they handle the mundane stuff like trash and water.
Right, because you cannot have a sovereign state if you cannot flush the toilets. If Italy decides to shut off the water, the Holy See is in trouble. How much of this is actually independent versus just being a subsidized neighborhood of Rome?
It is a fascinating mix of complete independence and total reliance. Under the Lateran Treaty, Italy is actually required to provide certain services, for instance, water. The Vatican gets its water from an Italian aqueduct, but once it crosses the border, the Vatican manages its own internal grid. They have their own pumping stations and their own reservoir, same for electricity. They buy power from the Italian national grid, but they have their own backup generators and a massive solar array on the roof of the Paul VI audience hall. They actually produce a surprising amount of renewable energy for their size.
I remember seeing those solar panels. It is a bit of a funny image, the ancient architecture of the church topped with high-tech silicon. But wait, if they produce their own energy, does that mean they have their own department of energy? Who is the guy in charge of fixing the solar panels?
They actually have a whole department called the Servizi Tecnici, or Technical Services. It's part of the governorate. They have their own electricians, plumbers, and even a team of specialized restoration experts. It's basically a miniature public works department. They even have their own fire department. The Vatican Fire Brigade has about 30 members and a fleet of red trucks. They mostly deal with minor incidents or elevator rescues, since those old buildings have very temperamental elevators. But they are a fully trained professional force.
But what about the less glamorous stuff? Trash collection. Does the Vatican have its own garbage trucks?
They do. They have a dedicated waste collection service. They are actually very big on recycling. They have a green center inside the walls where they sort everything from paper to organic waste. But the funny part is the logistics. Once the Vatican garbage truck picks up the trash, where does it go? They do not have a landfill or an incinerator inside that 0.44 square kilometers. So, they have an agreement where the trash is handed over to the Italian authorities for final disposal. It is a seamless transition. You see the Vatican truck drive up to a specific gate, and on the other side, it is Italy's problem.
It feels like a very polite version of not in my backyard, except the backyard is the entire country. What about the police? I know we have the Swiss guards in their colorful Renaissance outfits, but they are mostly ceremonial and for the Pope's personal safety, right? Who handles a pickpocket in St. Peter's Square?
That is where it gets legally complex. St. Peter's Square is technically part of the Vatican, but it is usually open to the public and policed by the Italian state police, the Polizia di Stato. There is a specific division called the Inspectorate of Public Security at the Vatican. They patrol the square up to the steps of the Basilica. Once you cross onto the steps, you are in the jurisdiction of the Gendarmerie Corps of Vatican City State.
The gendarmerie. Those are the guys in the more modern blue uniforms.
Right. They are the actual police force. They handle internal security, traffic control, and criminal investigations. They have a high-tech operations center, they have a rapid response unit, and they even have a small detention center. Though, to be fair, if someone commits a serious crime, the Vatican usually invokes an article of the Lateran Treaty that allows them to hand the perpetrator over to Italy for trial and imprisonment. Italy essentially acts as the Vatican's prison system.
That is a great deal for the Vatican. You get all the sovereignty, but none of the overhead of running a maximum security penitentiary. But what about the courts? If I steal a souvenir in the Vatican, do I go before a judge in a robe who quotes canon law at me?
Not exactly. They have a civil court system for crimes committed on their territory. It's based on the Italian Penal Code from the late 1800s with some modifications. But here's a fun fact. The Vatican's crime rate is technically the highest in the world, not because it's a dangerous place, but because of the math. If you have 18 million tourists a year and only 800 citizens, and one tourist steals a wallet, the crimes per capita statistic goes through the roof. It's a statistical quirk of being a tiny country with a massive transient population.
It reminds me of those sovereignty as a service models we have talked about before with island dependencies. It is like Italy is the back office provider for the Vatican's front-end sovereignty.
That is exactly what it is. And you see it in the economy too. The Vatican does not have a traditional economy. There are no corporate taxes, no income taxes for residents. Their revenue comes from three main sources: the Vatican museums, which are a massive cash cow, the sale of stamps and coins, and Peter's pence, which are the donations from Catholics worldwide.
Wait, let's talk about the coins. Daniel asked about the little things. The Vatican uses the euro, but they mint their own, right?
They do. They have a monetary agreement with the European Union. Even though they are not in the EU, they use the euro as their official currency. They are allowed to mint a certain amount of coins every year with the Pope's image on the back. These are legal tender throughout the entire Eurozone. You could theoretically buy a gelato in Paris with a Vatican euro, though you would never do that because the collector value of the coin is way higher than its face value.
I remember hearing about the sede vacante coins. How does that work? If there's no pope, who goes on the coin?
That is a great deep dive. When a pope dies or resigns, and the see is vacant, they actually mint special coins featuring the coat of arms of the Cardinal Camerlengo, who is the temporary administrator. These are incredibly rare because the vacancy usually only lasts a few weeks. It's a literal currency for an interregnum. It's also one of the few ways the Vatican manages its brand during a leadership transition. Collectors go absolutely nuts for them.
I love that. It is a state that funds itself through its own brand. It is the ultimate influencer business model, except the influencer is the successor of St. Peter. But let's go back to the border. It is a city within a city. Is there a hard border? Do I need to show my passport to go to a mass?
For St. Peter's Square and the Basilica, no. It is an open border. You just walk through the metal detectors, which are manned by Italian police. But for the rest of the city, the Vatican City proper, where the offices and gardens are, it is a very hard border. There are massive stone walls and specific gates like the Santa Ana Gate. To get through those, you need a specific reason and a pass. It is one of the most secure borders in the world because it is so small and so easily monitored.
But what about the shops? I've heard there's a legendary duty-free store inside the Vatican. Can any Roman just walk in and buy a cheap bottle of scotch and some tax-free cigarettes?
Absolutely not. The Annona, which is the Vatican supermarket, and the department store in the old railway station are strictly for residents and employees. You need a tessera, a special electronic card, to even get through the door. Because there are no Italian taxes applied, things are significantly cheaper, sometimes 20% less than in Rome. It's one of the perks of the job, but they are very strict about it. You can't buy in bulk to resell on the Italian black market. The gendarmerie keeps a close eye on the inventory.
It is such a strange paradox. It is the most universal organization on Earth, representing over 1 billion people, but it operates out of a fortress that is smaller than a golf course. And it relies on a country, Italy, that it was technically at war with, or at least in a Cold War with, for decades.
And that relationship with Italy is still the most important diplomatic tie they have. The Lateran Treaty even specifies things like the extraterritorial properties. There are buildings outside the Vatican walls, like the headquarters of certain church offices or the Pope's summer residence at Castel Gandolfo, that are technically in Italy but have the same status as an embassy. Italian police cannot enter them without permission. It is a Swiss cheese model of sovereignty.
Castel Gandolfo is an interesting one. It's miles away from the Vatican. Does that mean there's a tiny little Vatican island in the middle of a random Italian town?
Precisely. It's about 55 hectares, so it's actually larger than the Vatican City itself. When the Pope is there, it's legally as if he never left the Vatican. It has its own farm that produces milk and eggs for the Pope's table. In fact, during World War II, thousands of refugees were hidden there because the Nazis respected, mostly, the extraterritorial status of the property. It's a perfect example of how sovereignty can be a literal lifesaver, even when it's just a legal fiction agreed upon by two governments.
It makes me wonder about the future of this model. We talk a lot about digital nations or charter cities. The Vatican is basically the original charter city. It is a specialized jurisdiction with its own rules, carved out of a larger state for a specific purpose. If you are a tech founder today looking at network states, the Vatican is the proof of concept that has actually lasted.
I was thinking about that exactly. If you think about the sovereign individual, or the idea of citizenship tied to a mission rather than a piece of land, the Vatican has been doing that since 1929. The fact that their citizenship is functional is a total precursor to what people are talking about now with digital nomad visas or e-residency in places like Estonia. But the Vatican takes it to the logical extreme. You don't just get a visa, you get a passport and a seat at the UN, all because you have a role in a specific hierarchy.
But isn't there a risk there? If the mission changes or the network moves online, does the physical territory become a liability? Could we ever see a virtual Vatican that abandons the 110 acres but keeps the UN seat?
That's the million-dollar question. In international law, to be a state, you generally need a defined territory and a permanent population. The Vatican barely meets those criteria as it is. If they gave up the land, they would likely lose their status as a state and revert to being just an international organization like the Red Cross. The physical hardware of the Vatican City state is what protects the software of the Holy See's diplomatic status. Without the dirt, they're just another NGO.
It also shows that sovereignty is not binary. It is not like you are either a country or you are not. It is a spectrum of functional independence. The Vatican is sovereign because the rest of the world agrees to treat it that way, and because Italy provides the physical infrastructure to make that treatment possible. It is a collaborative performance of statehood.
And it works because it is mutually beneficial. Italy gets the prestige of having the center of the Catholic world in its capital, plus a huge amount of tourism revenue that spills over from the Vatican museums. The Vatican gets the security and the back office services they need to run their global operation without having to worry about things like sewage treatment plants or a standing army beyond the Swiss Guard.
Though I still think the Swiss Guard is the coolest part. Imagine your day job involves wearing a striped uniform designed by someone who may or may not have been inspired by Michelangelo, carrying a halberd, and being a citizen of a country that fits inside a park.
It is a unique life for sure, but back to Daniel's question about the little things. The Postal Service is another great example. The Posta Vaticana is actually known for being more efficient than the Italian postal system. A lot of people in Rome will actually walk to the Vatican border to mail their letters from a Vatican mailbox because they know it will get where it is going faster. They have their own stamps, their own sorting office, and they are a member of the Universal Postal Union.
Wait, if they're so efficient, do they handle international shipping? Can I order a pizza from Rome and have it delivered via Vatican Post to bypass Italian traffic?
Haha, I wish. But they do have their own fleet of vehicles. They even have a Vatican pharmacy, which is world famous. Because they don't have to follow Italian pharmaceutical regulations in the same way, they often carry medications that aren't yet available or are hard to find in Italy. It's one of the few places in the world where a sovereign state's primary export to its neighbors is essentially high-end mail service and rare medicine.
So the Vatican is basically the premium version of the services provided by the City of Rome. Better mail, better solar panels, and a much better art collection.
Precisely. And they even have their own phone system and internet domain, .va. They have their own television center and radio station. They are fully equipped to broadcast to the world independently. It is about maintaining that direct line to the citizens of the Church worldwide without having to rely on any other state to facilitate that communication. That is the heart of their sovereignty. It is about communication and influence, not territory.
This really reframes the whole idea of what a country is. We usually think of a country as a place where people are born, live, and die, and where the government provides everything from roads to healthcare. The Vatican is more like a sovereign headquarters. It is a headquarters with a zip code and an army.
And it raises some interesting questions about the future of governance. If we can have a sovereign headquarters for a religion, why not for a global environmental organization or a global tech cooperative? The Vatican model shows that if you have enough history, enough influence, and a willing host nation, you can create a legal space that operates outside the normal rules of geography.
It's basically the ultimate special economic zone, but for the soul instead of for manufacturing. But Herman, what about the money? We talked about coins, but do they have a central bank? Is there a Vatican Wall Street?
They have the IOR, the Institute for the Works of Religion. It's often called the Vatican Bank. It's not a central bank in the sense that it sets interest rates, but it manages the assets of religious orders and Catholic institutions globally. It's been controversial in the past, mostly because its sovereign status made it very opaque. Over the last decade, they've had to do a massive amount of work to align with international anti-money laundering standards just to stay connected to the global banking system. It turns out even a sovereign state has to follow the rules of the neighborhood if it wants to use the neighborhood's ATMs.
It is a fascinating case study in how to exist in the cracks of the Westphalian state system. We have this idea that the whole world is divided into these neat colored shapes on a map, but the Vatican is like a little pixel that refuses to be colored in.
And it is a pixel that has a massive impact on the rest of the screen. When the Holy See speaks at the UN, they are not speaking as a tiny city-state with 800 people. They are speaking for a global institution. Their sovereignty in Rome gives them the legal standing to be a player on the world stage in a way that no other NGO or religious group can match.
So, to summarize for Daniel, yes, they issue passports, but only to people with jobs. No, they don't have typical permanent residence because everyone is there on a temporary functional basis. And yes, they are separate from Italy, but in a way that looks more like a very high-end outsourcing agreement than a hard border.
That is the perfect way to put it. It is sovereignty as a service provided by the Italian Republic to the successor of St. Peter. It is one of the most successful and longest-running diplomatic compromises in history.
It makes me want to go check my own passport. I'm pretty sure it does not have a papal seal, which feels like a missed opportunity for the Irish government, honestly. We can use a bit more flair in our travel documents.
I think your sloth identity might conflict with the active service requirement for Vatican citizenship, CORN. You would have to move a bit faster than your usual pace to keep up with the diplomatic cables.
Hey, I am very efficient when I need to be. I am just judicious with my energy. Like the Vatican, I focus on the high-level strategy and leave the municipal services to someone else.
Fair enough. I think we have covered the operational side of the Holy See pretty thoroughly. It is a reminder that the world is much weirder and more complex than the maps in our old-school textbooks suggest.
It really is. And it is a great example of how sovereignty is something that has to be maintained and performed every day, through every stamp sold and every trash can emptied.
Well, I think that is a good place to wrap up this look at the world's most interesting microstate. Before we go, I want to give a huge thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to dive into these weird rabbit holes every week.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying these deep dives, a quick review on your favorite podcast app really helps us reach more people who are curious about how the world actually works.
Find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive of over 1,600 episodes, including some other ones where we talk about the architecture of sovereignty and how borders are invented.
We will see you next time.
Stay weird. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.